Thanks to everyone who joined us this evening. I'm really excited about this talk. It was an idea that I had to bring a speaker of this sort to the group. I thought it was an interesting topic that was getting a lot of attention in the press and in literature and in scientific writing. And so when I was recommended to Professor von Volkenburgh, I was thrilled that she agreed to speak with us, and coming to us all the way from the left coast and Washington State. And I'm glad that Zoom is available for us so that we can hear her presentation and get to know her work a little bit. So Liz is a professor emerita of biology at the University of Washington in Seattle, and her research has centered on how plants grow, especially the leaves of plants. She has a BS in botany from Duke, a PhD in plant physiology from the University of Washington. And after postdoc work at the University of Illinois and at the University of Lancaster in the UK, she accepted a position at the University of Washington and developed her plant growth lab. Students there worked with her on leaf growth in beans, poplar, Arabidopsis, tomato, corn, and sunflower. And research ranged from the molecular basis for light-induced leaf cell expansion to the adaptive value of leaf teeth. I didn't know leaves had teeth exactly, but I think I know what you're talking about. And the mechanism underlying drought tolerance in beans. And this work has involved international colleagues from the Netherlands and the Czech Republic and from Colombia. And throughout her work, Liz has been fascinated by what plants do and how they do it. In other words, plant behavior. She's a founding member and president of the Society for Plant Neurobiology, which is probably a term that is relatively recent in the sciences. And so I think we're going to be interested to hear more about that. So the Society for Plant Neurobiology, Plant Signaling, and Behavior. And before I turn it over to Liz, I wanted to make one comment about the summary that you sent me, which then got posted in our newsletter and webpage, about how we know that plants transmit signals to attract pollinators. Okay, I think we know that. And we take for granted that plants are aware of and respond to herbivores. And I'm sure that, Liz, you know that, but I bet a whole lot of people on this call and in the general public don't know that. And so perhaps you can tell us a little bit more. And then your summary goes on to talk about some of the even more amazing things that plants are capable of, or that we think perhaps are capable of. So as I said, I'm very excited to hear from you, and I will turn it over to you now for your presentation.
Thank you so much, Ross. And thank you, everyone, for inviting me and being here. And I'm going to share my screen and hope it all goes well. So the introduction was terrific, Ross, and thank you. And I want to say also here at the beginning that I have a PowerPoint presentation here I'm happy to give and make comments ad hoc along the way. But if there are questions and I see them in the chat, I'd be happy to answer them. Also, feel free to interrupt me, somebody who wants to unmute and interrupt me. I'm happy to have a back and forth. So even though I don't want to run over your time limit, it could go long, and so I'll try to be brief. But if you interrupt me, then I'll shorten something else I had in mind saying. So let's make this worth everybody's while. Yes, I'm a professor emerita. I don't like to be called emeritus too much, but that's the default. I retired from teaching a few years ago and am active in the Society of Plant Signaling and Behavior, which is gaining steam after 20 years of presenting some of what I'm about to present and then a whole lot more. So the question that I was asked to address by Ross Campbell was, do plants communicate, or could I talk about plant communication? And I appreciated, Ross, your invitation very much because it was serious. It was not what I call a tree hugging invitation, but rather an invitation about what do we really know and how did we know it and what good is it for us to know some of these things. So I've done my best to put together a more or less scientific talk with some fun here. And I'm happy to entertain scientific questions to the best of my ability. And I also acknowledge that people are people, and most of us love plants. And our love for plants is generally not scientific, but some other place. And we can encompass all of those aspects in considering how plants communicate. So, do plants communicate? And if so, how? For what purpose? And how do we know? When I was teaching, I had all my students over the years collecting cartoons. So here's my first. Check out this guy, Lois, artificial for sure. So stop for a moment and ask yourself or your friend next to you, what do we mean by communicate or communication? And I'm going to pause here for a moment because I want us all to think about this word, communicate or communication. What do we mean by it? And then remember that we're here talking about plant communication. So what might we mean by the term communicate in terms of plants? I don't know if anybody wants to shout out an answer or put it in the chat. And if not, I'll go on. I did look up the definitions of communicate. And in the Merriam-Webster posted online or the Cambridge Dictionary, we get something similar. I like the second one better. To share information with others by speaking, writing, moving your body, or using other signals. So for plants, I think what we can focus on here is that communication involves transmitting something, information, and receiving that something. So the communication can be within a cell, it can be within an organ, it can be within a body, it can be between bodies and between organs within one body. So communication goes all kinds of different ways, but it's the transmission of information, reception of that information. That's the definition that I tried to adhere to when I was pulling together this talk. And then I was asked by a helpful partner, what are some examples of nonverbal communication? Because humans, we generally think of as communicating verbally, although there may be other ways. If there are other ways, seeing as how plants apparently don't have verbal communication, what are some examples of nonverbal communication? In humans, you can find many examples discussed in various places. I just gathered these pictures together where you can see eye-to-eye contact, for example, is one way of people communicating with each other. Facial features are ways of communicating. Braille is quasi non-verbal. Of course, it's verbal, but the communication comes to the human via feel. There are the language we use with our hands to convey thoughts when people are hard of hearing or for other reasons. And then there's body posture shown on the right. So these are just some examples of nonverbal communication among humans. And it's good to realize that we do communicate often amongst ourselves as humans without words. So we're not reliant on words. There are many ways of communicating. There are also examples of nonverbal communication among plants. And I put up a cartoon here. This man eating his dinner says, you know very well you're not supposed to beg at the table. And this Venus flytrap has grown out to gather up some dinner from his plate. And surely the Venus flytrap didn't speak to that man, so it's just its aspect of being quite menacing that was its communication, right? We all know Venus flytraps, they get what they need. So I put a comment in here, yes, I guess all communication among plants is nonverbal, but I want to say that some researchers, plant ecologists and plant biologists, propose deciphering a language that is used among plants, and we'll come to that in some of the later slides. And that language has to do with creation of, transmission of, reception of, and acting on the basis of communicated molecules. So it's not the way we hear sound in words or read words by our eyes, but in the case of plants, a different kind of language. The researchers are using language as a way of catching that communication, but it isn't language in the way that we use it for humans. I also want to say something else right here at the beginning, is that plant communication per se is a subset of plant behavior. And every time I gathered up something from my background or knowledge of current literature for this talk, I realized 3/4 of the time it was plant behavior, not plant communication. And so I threw it out. So this talk is about plant communication. And I'm happy to entertain further questions about plant behavior if we get to that at any point. So I pardon me, please, for limiting to plant communication. Both topics are big. Plant behavior is even bigger. So the outline for what I have to say, generally for the next half hour maybe, is to give you examples of plants communicating, familiar examples, unfamiliar but not surprising examples, and then some really, to me, quite surprising examples. And as much as I'm able, I'm putting, especially towards the latter part in the wow, really part of the talk, a theme of transmission, what's transmitted, sensing, what is sensed and how is it sensed, what's the purpose of this communication, and what evidence do we have that it happens. So that repeating theme is a little bit of the science part. I hope it's not tedious. I organized my slides all around it, and hopefully it'll keep some of this conversation straight. So let's start with the familiar examples. Once again, we're talking about plant communication, communication by plants with other organisms. And we all know that plants communicate, even if we never thought about it as communication. So certainly roses smell wonderfully, and many people love the way roses smell. So in that sense, the rose is communicating with humans, it communicates with pollinators. It's probably not true that all of the odors, which are volatile compounds emitted by plants, are purposed for pollination, but those are the ones that we know most about. Another familiar example, again, having to do with pollen, the purpose of pollination, are volatile compounds emitted by flowers or inflorescences that draw in pollinators by stinking rather than by smelling sweet. And the picture on the right here is of a voodoo lily, which is in the arum family. And that flower probably is standing 6 or more feet tall in the greenhouse. And if you cut it open, the center picture, the golden picture in the center, shows a pile of male flowers on top of a pile of female flowers. So this is an inflorescence. And as this whole thing becomes ripe, the appendix here, which is this large organ in the middle of the flower, warms up, and the warmth causes volatilization of aromatic compounds that are in the appendix, and they are shed or wafted into the air, and pretty soon everywhere around this flower stinks to high heaven. Probably you have greenhouses in the DC area who put on this show, especially around Halloween. We have some in Seattle. They still draw lots of people every year. And what the flower is doing is attracting pollinators, and the flower will attract the pollinators who come down into the center. The pollen sheds and no, yes, the pollen sheds and the pollinators get the pollen on their back, and then they go to another flower and contribute that pollen to another flowers, the lower part, before their pollen sheds, and it's a way of causing cross pollination, the differential development of the male and female flowers in the bottom of this flower. So I think I meant to point out here that the flower appendix makes many, many volatile compounds. The mix of them make for smelling like rotting feces, or I don't know, the bottom of a latrine is what some people have said. It smells really awful and draws the pollinators that that plant is needing to have to cross its genes. A much milder example is on the left, a little miniature voodoo lily. Another example that's familiar to us of how plants communicate is by their color. So you can see that hummingbirds often are attracted to the color red, which is why we make our hummingbirds feeders out of something red. The coloration of fruits attracts the dispersal agents for those fruits. So you can see the tomato from day 1 to day 7 turning red. You can see in the middle of this slide a picture of a toucan eating berries. It looks to me like that bird is eating the green berries, but I would think it was attracted by the red berries. I don't know, didn't ask him. It's really interesting to know how oftentimes bees see flowers by the ultraviolet light that's emitted from the flower rather than by the visible wavelengths that we see. So humans would see that daisy-like flower as pink, and the bee sees it as some white arrows pointing towards the center of the flower. So the bee eye is picking up different wavelengths from the plants other than what the human eye is picking up. Another example here on the right is a plant that grows in shards of stone. It looks on a mountainside, perhaps. It's a little hard to see the plant. And in that case, the plant has coloration that mimics its substrate and acts as a way of defending the plant. So I would say that the plant is communicating to predators that the plant is not there. It looks like a rock. In the last panel here are some green leaves, and I didn't realize that this was a thing. I had it in the back of my mind and I looked it up, and it seems to be a thing that plants can naturally mimic having been eaten or in some ways made sick, maybe by a virus. So on the left, you can see a nice green leaf, and then adjacent to it is a leaf that has yellow coloration and spots. And in C, you see a 3-part trifoliate leaf that's nice and green, and next to it is one yellow with spots. And there's have been mutations identified which lead to the coloration, and in some places those mutations are carried by the plants through generations, because the coloration that makes the plant look like it's been eaten or is sick will defend the plant from herbivores in that locale. So it's a positive mutation that's inherited for defense. I thought that was kind of surprising. In our greenhouse at the University of Washington, we have some plants that make the coloration of the yellow spots. And as we gave tours to our students, we talked about how that plant was mimicking having been eaten by herbivores. And as a consequence, it's documented that the plants in the wild are eaten less by herbivores because they already look eaten. So another familiar example is body shape. may be familiar to some, maybe not all. On the left, you can see a couple of orchids, and one of them on the top, I think, is called a hammer orchid. And there is a pollinator sitting on that orchid to the left. And it's attracted to sitting on the orchid by the little blob on the right that the orchid made, that's plant material that makes it look like an insect. And there are many examples in the Orchidaceae of orchid flowers that mimic parts of animals in order to attract those animals in to pollinate or in some way help the plant. On the bottom, you see a pretty picture of an orchid that's made something like a bee face. And there are just many, many examples of this kind of mimicry in the orchid family. And you have to call it body shape. It could be called coloration as well. And over the eons of evolution, the orchids have evolved a variety of body shapes and coloration all around attracting pollinators. Another nice example is this one of the mimosa, which I think you know is called the sensitive plant. And if you touch it, it will fold up its leaflets and its leaves and sometimes its stems. And so after touching that mimosa, the poor plant looks all collapsed. And it's been documented that that collapsed form is a defensive form and is not attractive to herbivores. So this mechanism of closing up, which is a very fascinating mechanism studied for the transmission of electrical signals within the mimosa plant, that mechanism of closing up is a defensive mechanism, and it changes the body shape of the plant, which is what is communicated to the herbivore. And then finally down in the right is a picture of how many can you see, maybe 4 plants in the genus called Lithops. And the plants look like the rocks they're growing in, which, similar to the slide before, is showing a way in which plants communicate using body shape that they are in fact rocks and not edible. So I would call that a kind of communication. Okay, now I'm moving into unfamiliar modes of communication, but not surprising. Ross, maybe you can help me. I'm not watching the chat as we go along. And so if anybody has a question I've missed, I'm happy to be interrupted. And or wait to the end, either way. So allelopathy is a term that describes competition among plants, generally occurring in the soil. And an allelopathic reaction looks like these pictures show. On the left is a black walnut tree. Black walnut trees secrete a compound called juglone, and juglone is poisonous to most other plants, and so they can't grow underneath black walnuts. And on the right is a picture of the grass. It's rye, and rye is also allelopathic. And you can see that the ground around the rye is mostly soil, and the plants are held at bay some distance from the row of rye. And that's because the rye has also secreted some soluble compounds. The diagram at the top shows an allelopathic winner in the middle, and that plant is releasing water-soluble phenolic compounds that flow in the soil solution and impregnate or imbue all the soil around that allelopathic winner with what ends up being growth retardants or poisons that keep competitors at bay. This is a very common way in which plants communicate with their neighbors, and it's called allelopathy when there's the winner that's keeping away the losers on the side. This is another example of soluble compounds being communicated among plants. And I will just preface this slide by saying that Suzanne Simard's work with trees and forests, starting in the Pacific Northwest and now involving forests all over the world. Her work is profound and has been instrumental in changing a lot of people's minds about how plants work, how trees work, how forests work, and the importance of mycorrhizae. And I want to give Suzanne Simard the most possible positive credit for that work that she has done. And maybe many of you know her book, Finding the Mother Tree, which I haven't read. I do have a copy, and it probably sums up most of her work. I also want to say here at the outset, and we can discuss it further later if you'd like, that the scientific basis of Suzanne Simard's conclusions are under heavy dispute. And there have been a lot of different research teams who've tried to repeat and find what she found and have not. And there are other groups that have, prior to Suzanne Simard and since, done similar work and found that that kind of communication that she reports does not happen. So this is quite a controversial area, and I think we need to recognize scientifically that it's a controversial area. What Suzanne Simard has done is draw our attention to the possibility that trees are in communication with fungi, bacteria, and what have you in the soil, and then those in turn are in communication with other trees, and that forests and landscapes are interconnected ecological settings. She's drawn attention to that in a way that plant ecologists had not drawn attention to it before. It's very important work that she's done in that regard. And all the contradictions and fights in the literature about her findings cannot, I think, in my mind anyway, detract from the good work that she has enabled. What I did here on the slide was just showed one of the figures from the paper that she published in 1980, which was the genesis of the term Wood Wide Web. And what they did is, in controlled plots outside of the lab, provided some plants with 13 labeled carbon and other plants labeled with nitrogen. And then they checked to see where those labels went. And their conclusion was that in deep shade, there was more exchange of nutrients from plant to plant through the root zone than in full light. And I think you can understand how they then got to the idea that plants, when they have plenty of light, don't need to communicate nutrients one to the other or share. But when they're in deep shade, then the taller, bigger trees at the top of the canopy will provide sugars and nitrogen compounds to the other plants that are in the understory. And that's kind of the basis of the idea of finding the mother tree. I put here that the purpose of this sharing of nutrients might be called altruism. And certainly in the work by different people who've read Suzanne Simard's work and then published on their own, they use the term altruism, that mother tree is altruistically helping the baby trees, etc. Altruism has also been described in plant communities in other ways by other groups for other purposes. And so altruism may actually be a thing in plants, and it's accomplished by a communication. In the case of Suzanne Simard's work, I would say it's more likely that trees in bright sunlight have an excess of sugars and they leak them out. And if there are any baby trees around, they're going to suck them up. And I don't know that that's communication, but that is certainly leaking and sharing of substrates. So now this is another historic piece of work that set off a lot of conversation. And I draw attention to the work of David Rhodes. He was in the Department of Zoology at the University of Washington slightly before my time. And although he was working in a lab in zoology, he ended up focusing on tent caterpillars, I think it was, but their host was populus trees and other Pacific Northwest deciduous trees. And what he noticed is that if there were some of these caterpillars ravaging a poplar tree, that the trees nearby that stand would not be ravaged. And then he did some experiments where he isolated the caterpillars so that they couldn't be in contact by air with other trees. And then he did further experiments, and he came up with the notion that when the caterpillars are eating the leaves of the poplar, that a gas is emitted that flows to nearby poplars. And that gas alerts the nearby poplars to become inedible. And then the caterpillars are not able to digest those neighboring leaves. And as a result, the caterpillars give up and go away, and the neighboring trees remain healthy. And the result of those publications, which were a little bit obscure and very hard to read and pretty hard to find today, was a lot of New York Times reporting about talking trees. And two of the grad students from the lab where David Rhodes was went out and did further work and confirmed what he had found, that trees that are wounded emit gases which can be perceived by neighboring trees, and those perceptions lead to the synthesis of defensive chemicals inside the leaves that protect them from herbivores. So it was called talking trees. And you might imagine that at the time, maybe you remember, I don't remember, but at the time, the idea that trees could talk was about as laughable as had been in the early 70s when the book The Secret Life of Plants was published. In The Secret Life of Plants, as a book written by non-scientists, was really fun to read. I enjoyed reading it, but it also was laughed at because it put forward ideas that plants could communicate in ways that everybody knew were not true. In The Secret Life of Trees, and also this publicization of talking trees, kind of came down hard on the scientists working in the field. People from outside science were saying, oh, that's laughable. These scientists are full of baloney, and then didn't want to fund plant biology anymore. So Davy Rhodes was sidelined, and it took about 25 years for his work to be picked up by others, and then roundly, thoroughly confirmed. Another example that happened right after Rhodes's work was published is this fun, if you look at the videos that came out in the 90s. The story is that acacia trees in Africa are killing kudus, the antelopes. And when they try to figure out what was wrong with the kudus, the antelopes, and found that acacia trees were poisoning them, they kept looking into the story further, and they found something like what Rhodes had found, which is when the acacia tree is bitten or chewed upon by a kudu or an antelope, the acacia tree leaves emit a gas that travels to other acacia trees, which in turn biosynthesize in their leaves toxins, which when the antelope come over there and eat those leaves, they die. So this is a defensive mechanism that the plants use. And the communication from one acacia plant to the other is these volatile compounds. Okay, and along these same lines, volatile compounds, is this lovely story, The Silent Scream of the Lima Bean, which is not just happening in lima beans, but in actually lots and lots of plants. And in this case, when a caterpillar chomps on the leaf, that leaf and the other leaves in the plant make gases, volatile compounds. The volatile compounds are attractive to wasps. The wasps come and lay eggs inside of the caterpillars, and that kills the caterpillars and makes more wasps. So the silent scream of the lima bean is the emitting of volatile compounds by the chomped upon lima bean plant. And the communication is going from the lima bean, calling for help from the wasp, which will parasitize the caterpillar. Okay, a couple of more slides here on volatile compounds just to get at the mechanism a little bit. You probably know about our plant Arabidopsis thaliana, which has been a lab rat for plant biologists for 20, 30 years. It's a very small plant. You see it everywhere. It's weedy. It has a small genome. It's been sequenced. Everybody knows all of what the genes, or a lot of the genes in Arabidopsis do. And knowing that about Arabidopsis has led to knowing a lot about plants in general. So Arabidopsis was used in this experiment using caterpillars and leaves to try to figure out how the communication system works. And so you can see in the diagram here an air pump passing air over some Arabidopsis plants, probably in pots, with caterpillars on top of them. Now, remember, the caterpillars are chomping those leaves. And if Arabidopsis is like a lima bean or an acacia or a poplar, it's going to emit volatile compounds. So those volatile compounds end up in the airstream and then were passed over an unwounded, happy little Arabidopsis plant. And you can see using a camera that catches fluorescence that's created by inserted fluorescent molecule, that when the volatiles pass over the unbitten Arabidopsis plant, there's a lighting up in green that indicates that the cells inside of those leaves are accumulating calcium, releasing calcium from stores. And calcium inside of plant cells acts like it does inside of our cells. It's part of the signaling system that indicates a signal has been received. So in this case, the volatile compound lights up the Arabidopsis leaf saying that volatile compound is there. And then the result, I don't know for sure in Arabidopsis, but certainly in lima beans, is that volatile calling for help for the wasp is initiated. And in acacia, when the calcium signal comes, then what the acacia does is creates toxins that are going to kill kudus. So calcium is a general signal, and in Arabidopsis, it looks like this with the appropriate technology. And it probably happens in all plants when they perceive a signal that's meaningful to them. One more kind of classical paper that I especially like for reasons I could go into later. Wilden is a plant electrophysiologist, and he used electrodes placed on the surface of tomato plants. And then what he did is he used pliers, not caterpillars, but pliers. And he wounded a lower leaf and then measured an electric signal that passed through the lower leaf to the upper leaf. And later in other work, they found that the upper leaves changed their biochemistry and created toxins in response to the lower leaf being wounded. So that electric signal looks a lot like an action potential. Action potentials are what our nerves and our heart and our brain throw out electrically as electrically communicating signals in our bodies. Turns out plants are communicating within their bodies using action potentials all the time, but we didn't seem to know it. And plants also have another kind of electric signal called a slow wave potential. It's not an action potential that elicits different kinds of responses. So Wilden's paper, when it came out, oh gosh, I think 85 or so, I don't have the date on there, was a groundbreaking paper because the other scientists, especially Diana Bowles at the end, the other scientists are very well known and respected molecular geneticists. And here they were publishing that plants had electric responses. So it opened up the field for plant communication even further. Okay, now I'm going to go into the wow, really part of my talk, which is going to be bolstered by some data, but don't worry, not too much. And I would just like for you to know that this is the tip of the iceberg. There are a lot of examples that are very surprising in plants. The first one I have here is plants using soluble compounds that travel through the soil solution to communicate their status to their neighbors. And the way this work was done is by a split root test. And I don't know if my pointer works very well, but you can see that the plants on the right of the center can are straddling a center can where a poison, or in this case, drought was imposed, and another can next door, which is perfectly well watered. And then another plant straddles that can and the next one. And then another plant straddles. So these plants are in communication with each other by sharing half their roots with their neighbor. And then their other roots go into a different pot. What the researchers did in this case is they imposed drought in the central pot, dried out the soil, and the plant that has half its roots in that pot is getting dried out, and the roots are sensing the drought, and they communicate to the upstairs part of that plant, uh-oh, and they close their stomates, which is what the picture at the bottom is showing. Not only does that plant with its root in the droughted soil close its stomates, but all the plants end up closing their stomates, even the one on the far right end that has all of its roots in well-watered soil. So that plant on the right end, the fourth plant on the right end, has roots in soil that has plenty of water, but the stomates are closed. And the stomates are closed because the roots that are drying out in the center have communicated one after the other through soluble compounds shared in those soil containers, that things are not all well with that one. The control is to the left, the unshared. Each of those plants has its roots only in well-watered soil. There's no contact among any of those four with the droughted soil. And as a result, all of them have their stomates open. So this work has been put forward many different ways in many different settings by Ariel Novoplansky. And he gave a TED talk where I got this picture from. This communication by the stress plant to fellow neighboring unstressed plants is via soluble compounds, and the purpose is for communal stress tolerance. And it happens with all different kinds of stresses, not just water stress. So again, with respect to soluble compounds, there are signals in the soil, or you could call them signals, they're molecules or conditions in the soil and organisms in the soil making all kinds of noise. And the roots are detecting all of those things using molecules on the surface of the root cells. So in the diagram in the bottom on the left, you see salt and flooding and drought and osmotic stress, and you could put in a bunch of other things as well. And those compounds are interacting with the surface of the root cells. And those root cells then have a biochemical reaction and will send signals up through the xylem to the upstairs part of the plant. And the upstairs part of the plant may close its stomates. If that's what happens, it happens because a molecule or a condition that was happening in the roots is communicated up to the leaves and the stomates. Sometimes the signals come from the upstairs to the downstairs, and the upstairs knows that there's some bad thing happening in the atmosphere. It might be shade, it could be neighbors that are hacking at it, and those communication will come down through the phloem, interact with the roots, and soluble compounds will be emitted by the roots rather than being sensed by the roots. So the whole plant is a sensory system, and the communications are happening to the roots, through the plant, and out of the roots. I mentioned earlier about plant language, and one of the people who's been crafting this idea and gathering evidence for it is Rick Carbon at UC Davis. And amazingly to me, he uses sagebrush as his go-to lab rat. And sagebrush, you can imagine, it's bushy and hard and it grows slowly and a little bit hard to do experiments with, but Rick has done a lot of amazing work. And this diagram at the bottom is not from Rick Carbon, but from a sum up of Carbon and others' work, showing the communications that can happen among roots, fungi and roots, among leaves and other organisms. Also, leaves can detect other leaves by color. And all of that communication is going on. And you could say it's going on for altruistic reasons. I'll come to that in a second. But rather than calling it altruism, Rick would call it reduced competition. So what Rick has seen is that sagebrush plants can recognize their kin from the same seed batch, and they will cooperate with their kin, but they will release compounds that are growth retarding to not kin.
Liz, I think Elise has a question.
Can you read it for me?
Oh, I was just going to unmute. So going back to the acacia, where an antelope starts chewing on it and then gives off gases to the next acacias, and then they form a toxin for the next antelope that eats from their tree. Is that more of a sort of an instigator gas chemical that then sort of forms a formula with the gases or the molecules that are already there on the plant, and that's just kind of an automatic function? Or does the new acacia recognize, oh, here's the signal, I've got to get A, B, and C together, put them all together in an equation and mix them all up, and then I'm okay?
If I'm right in understanding the way you've asked your question, I would answer it's an automatic response. And the data that I know is that the acacia trees emit ethylene. Ethylene is a hormone all plants emit all the time.
Mhm.
The ethylene is perceived by an uneaten acacia, but when ethylene is perceived, it stimulates regardless of where the ethylene came from or for why.
Okay.
The same biochemical pathway that leads to production of toxins that are toxic to kudus.
Okay.
Thanks for that question.
Sure.
And maybe more like that will come.
Okay.
Here's a cool one, which is very surprising. The two researchers, Consuelo de Moraes and Mark Mesher, 10, 15 years ago, were trying to figure out how this awful saprophytic plant, the dodder, was taking over tomato plants. And you can see the two researchers with their hands in the dodder. It looks like straw, but it's actually a living plant that's not photosynthetic. And in the lower right-hand corner, you can see a stem of a tomato seedling, and then the very small daughter plant, which is, again, it's saprophytic. It requires food that it gets from the tomato. That germinated daughter seedling grew in such a way it was searching for something to climb up, and it smelled the tomato plant and climbed up the tomato plant, and then in the process pushes its little polypodia feet things into the xylem and phloem of the tomato and sucks it dry. So the way these researchers figured out what was going on is they created some blotter paper quadrants. They put daughter seeds in the middle, and then they had either volatile compounds or other compounds go over the different quarters, and then they saw in which direction did the daughter seeds grow. And they were able to discern that in the case of tomato, these different compounds are volatiles that come out of the tomato, and some of them are more attractive to the daughter than others. These guys did a lot of experiments, and some of them involved putting wheat plants in with the tomato plants. And the daughter always went and infested the tomato, not the wheat. And so they compared the volatiles emitted by wheat and by tomato and found that the daughter is only sensitive to these main compounds coming out of the tomato. So in this case, unfortunately for the tomato, it's communicating to the daughter, here I am, and the daughter comes over and sets up shop and sucks it dry. So that's a kind of communication, just not maybe what the tomato was hoping for.
Liz, can I
Yes.
jump in and read a question to you from Anne, who's curious to know if the cutting of non-native invasive plants such as porcelainberry could send a distress signal that would negatively impact the native plants that we are trying to protect? Or might
Yes,
it
it's
might
an
it only
excellent-
signal to other porcelainberry? Go ahead.
It's an excellent question, and I, of course, don't know the answer. And first off, I would say the answer is proof of the pudding. If the native plants thrive, then they were not too disturbed by the cutting of the non-natives. But probably cutting of any plant is releasing chemicals, volatile compounds that are interpreted one way or another by its neighbors. Like to think of mowing grass. I happen to like the smell of it, but maybe grass doesn't. Yeah, that's a great question.
Thank you.
Another example is plants detecting each other by color or the wavelengths emitted by the plants. So this is a diagram on the top of how they did. Maria Crepey and Jorge Casal did this experiment. They grew different lines of Arabidopsis in rows, and they mixed them. They either were rows of pure siblings or rows of plants that were not kin at all. And then they measured seed production depending on those planting regimes. And what they noticed, which I think is just incredibly amazing, if you look at the two pictures on the top, and you see 3 Arabidopsis plants in pots, and the close-up on day 7, there are only 2. There's one leaf false colored red, and on day 5, that leaf is oriented overtopping a leaf of a neighbor. And on day 7, that leaf has moved so that the neighboring leaf is no longer shaded by it. So their research got to asking, how did that leaf know how to move, and why did it move? And does it make any difference? And so they did a lot of experiments by putting kin plants next to each other or kin and non-kin next to each other. And they found that generally speaking, the leaves would move away from shading each other if the 2 plants were kin. But if the 2 plants were not kin, then they would competitively shade each other. And so then they went and did a bit more work. And on the right-hand column, you can see from the side the body shape of these different plants. And you can, I think it's a little overdone here, but some look yellow and some look olive green. And so they're a little bit different colors. And the panels show the ratio of red to far red light emitted by that plant, or the amount of blue light emitted by that plant at different heights. And what these researchers have discovered is that 2 photoreceptor systems that we know about, we've known about for a long time in plants, involve phototropin, which is a blue light absorbing pigment, and phytochrome, which absorbs red and far red light. And these 2 compounds exist in all plants, in all cells, everywhere. But in the case of Arabidopsis, the sensory system adds up somewhere in the plant to tell, for instance, olive green plant that its neighbor is lime green, not olive green. And therefore the neighbor is not kin. And so I'm just going to overlap its leaves with my leaves. And I find this to be pretty much mind-blowing, but not nearly as mind-blowing as the next, wow, this is surprising report. And maybe you've heard of this because it's made a lot of news. This is work by Ernesto Giannoli and his colleague Fernando Carrasco Ura, and they are Chilean scientists, and they know this plant Bocchilla trifoliata. Now, Bocchilla is very hard to find in any nursery because all the scientists want to use it to do experiments with. What Giannoli and his group found was that in the woods in Chile, where Bocchilla is growing, if Bocchilla, the plant, which normally has a kind of nondescript ovate leaf, if that plant is growing over the top of leaves that have wavy edges, then Bocchilla makes wavy edges. And if Bocchilla is growing over the top of leaves with teeth, there you have some teeth, Ross, then Bocchilla will make teeth. And if Bocchilla is growing over the top of a plant that, I don't see it here, maybe it's this one. If Bocchilla is growing over the top of a plant that makes one little thorn at the tip of it, then Bocchilla will make a little thorn at the tip of its leaf. And I have to say that when I first saw this reported, I thought it was probably made up, and this was 10 years ago. And then I asked other people who had also been in those forests, and they said, no, no, it's not made up, it's for real. Bocchilla the plant can do this mimicking. And so how would it do it? It has to be a communication from the host plant to the Bocchilla. What is that communication? And there's been some work done on it. There's a lay scientist here in the Pacific Northwest who got some Bocchilla plants from a local nursery that now no longer can supply them because everybody wants them. And he grew his Bocchilla inside his house near a window, and he put some plastic ilex, you know, that kind of green plastic holly that you can get at Christmas time. He put that stuff along the path that the Bocchilla would grow over. And he found after the second year that his Bocchilla plants were mimicking the shape of the green plastic host. And this was published. And it made people crazy, I think, in part because it was a lay scientist who found out that Bocchilla could mimic plastic green leaves. So the work attracted the attention of František Beluška and Stefano Mancuso, who many years ago proposed the concept of ocelli, plant ocelli. And ocelli is a term used for eye spots in the alga Chlamydomonas. Chlamydomonas swims around and it has an eye spot, and people like to study it because it's a simpler eye than our eye. But Beluška and Mancuso thought, you know, roots, you can see that roots will grow away from light or roots will grow towards certain things, and maybe roots have eye spots. And so they developed the concept of eye spot for plants. And in the right, you can see a diagram from a review proposing how an eye spot might be located in a root or in a stem or in a leaf. And in the leaf, the eye spot is comprised of the positioning of the chloroplasts that are in the leaf cells. So Beluška and Mancuso believe that the Bocchilla is seeing its host, and that's how it knows how to make its shape different. But Ernesto Giannoli doesn't think that that's true. And he uses this theory that's been known for a long time in the literature, both for plants and other organisms, that there can be horizontal gene transfer. And it's not like the genes jump out of one plant into the other, but rather they are sucked up by an insect or a virus or a bacterium that inadvertently carries genetic material from one plant to another. And that genetic material can be then incorporated by the new plant and cause changes in the new plant. So that's horizontal gene transfer. It happens. What Giannoli thinks is that when the Bocchilla grows over a lobed leaf, that DNA from that lobed leaf horizontally transfers to the Bocchilla, and then tells the bocula to make lobes. And that's the work that he's doing.
Liz, could the plants be isolated in such a way that this DNA transfer wouldn't be possible, but that they could still see each other if they can see at all?
I believe he must be trying that, yes. And the Belushka lab has grown bocula in boxes with green paint of ginkgo leaves on the side. And the bocula plants make ginkgo leaves. So
So-
there's a little bit of battle between the two research groups. It would be cool to see what happens.
And Jonathan asked if how long the process is for the leaves to change, and you just mentioned this in the second year. So is that the typical response?
I think it took his name was White. I think it took him 2 years to get healthy bocula plants. A leaf will come out and grow to full size in about a month. And that's probably the time it takes to discern what shape it's going to become. I don't really know that. I tried those experiments myself, but I have to say none of my bocula mimicked anything. So bocula doesn't grow fast.
And lastly, for me, it's 8:05, just a time check. So I think you may be
Yeah.
nearing the end of your slides, and I'm sure there are other questions that people would like to ask.
Yeah, I will finish. A last wow, really, is that roots apparently can grow towards the sound of running water. This work was done by Monica Gagliano, and she did a lot of controls, and among those controls was not providing running water, but rather an audio tape of running water, and the roots grew toward it. There's work by Hadrani's lab, 2 pieces of work that I'd like to mention here. That when these Enothera flowers are exposed to the sound of bees, not the bees, but the sound of bees, they increase their production of nectar. And they can be exposed to other sounds that are not bee sounds, and they don't make more nectar. And an even more amazing publication from her lab recently is this one, where plants were exposed to different things, either drought or actual wounding or clipping off or sound. And then they collected all those sounds and they mixed them. And then they played them back to plants that had not been injured in one way or another. And the plants responded. So the plant sound that was made by a plant that had been droughted caused an undroughted plant to behave as if it had been droughted. And so in her view, in her hands, she says that plants, when they are experiencing their life, especially stresses, emit sounds that are detectable, recordable, mixable, and that those sounds can generate a response in fellow plants that have not had that same experience. And I would say that this sounds a bit like communication. So where's all this going? I think I'm just have 2 slides here on the use of all this kind of communication information in agriculture. An earlier version was by this company ePlant, which understands we all know that trees swell and shrink. So they created a device that could detect the swelling and shrinking of a tree. And as you might imagine, over the summer getting drier and drier, the swelling and shrinking is less and less. And so their data computation analysis could indicate when the forest or the trees need to be watered. So the ePlant has been using this. It's not meant to be communication, but the tree communicates its status by its rate of swelling and shrinking, using that communication to set irrigation patterns. And then this is just a general slide of robots, which the one picture of the robot called Terra Sentia is a little bit older, but I was amazed when I looked into it at how much robots are now making agricultural practices more precise. And in the cases of what I mentioned earlier, for example, if some pathogens or herbivores are affecting 5 or 6 soybean plants in a field, the robot will detect that and spray just that spot rather than having to spray acres and acres after some large number of plants get hit. So the precision of agriculture is increasing rapidly based on the deployment of these robots. And the robots are using sensors, sensing some of the things that we've talked about here and more every day. So Agnes says, after all of this, the tree says howdy to her. And she says, do you have any idea how complicated my life has just become? Thank you.
Thank you. Before opening up the floor to verbal questions, I'm going to read one from Samuel. What benefit might Bokia get from mimicking its neighbors?
Excellent question. I should have mentioned it there. Gianoli's group checked to see, and they found that plants, Bokila plants that were well mimicked over their host, resisted herbivory much better than Bokila plants that looked like Bokila, but not their host. So the mimicking, much like those yellow spotted leaves I talked about earlier, the mimicking by the Bokila of their host prevented herbivores that were looking for Bokila from finding it.
Thank you. Are there any folks who would like to ask a question verbally? Communicate verbally. Elise?
Yeah.
And I can't see everybody on the chat, so you'll just have to pipe up if you have a question. Elise, go ahead, please.
So I'm a scientist by education, but by career choice now I'm a garden coach. And without thinking scientifically at all, I'm in these gardens and I'm starting to become aware of what am I doing to this plant? Right? And what is my purpose? And some of the pruning things are because it's gotten, diseased or crossed branches or horribly out of shape or but some of them are just for the joy of the owner, right? Or the location, like it's overgrown the space that it was planted in, so it can be heart pruned, for instance. And then it will grow back and be lovely in that shape and healthy. And I'm beginning to say, like, who am I? Who am I to decide that? I usually answer it because, because I'm the queen right now. Somebody's asked me to be the queen. That's what I'm helping them with. But I'm just like really sensing this other level of interacting with plants that 40 years ago I wouldn't have thought about before. And I talked to some of my vegetarian friends, and sometimes some people are vegetarian because they don't digest meat well. Some are for other health reasons, and some are for moral reasons of no, I don't want to kill that smart animal and I'm like, well, just because you are too ignorant to know how smart a plant is, or we, not pointing blame, but like we don't know, so we're just going to assume that that's a better choice, has been coming up, in my mind over and over again now, as we get more information about the communication between plants or the complexities of how they live their lives.
Well, you really are addressing the larger conversation around all of this. I tried to allude to it a little with Suzanne Simard's work. And I also think that gardening and farming, both gardening and farming, are activities of humans with plants that are very, very important, and the plant and the human are working together.
Yeah,
So,
I point this out. I mean, I've worked with cancer patients and people recuperating from injury or loss or birth in their family. And we go to the garden and, we do our regular gardening, but we also see that in the garden, the garden gives back. There's energy in the garden, there's mindfulness in the garden that, when you have two branches that are crossed, and they're rubbing on each other. Well, okay, so scientifically, it's opening a wound and you might get disease in there. And so therefore, it's a healthy way of helping the plant. But there's also the mindfulness of, you know, have you had, and they're usually pretty big, they're not like they're the size of your finger, right? At least. So at one time they were doing something that was helping the plant, but now they've overgrown and now it's detrimental to the plant. So have you experienced having a routine or a relationship or an idea that worked for you for a while, but now is causing an injury? And you see all these natural metaphors in the garden, and there's just been so much that I've seen that's been giving back to the people I work with and myself, of just opening up our eyes and seeing plants as more in more dimensions than, oh, it's just pretty. We're looking at it like a painting, right? It's over
exactly.
there and it's beautiful, but we're like, we're in there now. We're in the midst of it, looking at a much deeper level.
I think you're right. And there's a lot that can be gained by working with plants, just the pleasure, their beauty, and also the physical activity of working with plants or walking among them. And nature is very important for humans to be in and experience. There's a concept called plant blindness, which in the psychological field is getting a lot of interest now, in which human beings see plants as green cardboard, the way you described, older way of looking at plants. The more we know about plants, the less like green cardboard they are. But you can't possibly tell a gardener or a farmer not to harvest or interfere with plants. That's what gardeners and farmers do. That's the way
Right,
humans
right.
interact with plants. So my view is the more we know, the more wisely we can interact.
Yeah,
But
it's a
there's
good
no
way of looking
guilt.
at it.
There's no guilt.
Yeah, and also, as humans, our rule of thumb is we have to kill to survive. So we
Elise, let
do
me just
something,
interrupt.
right?
I'm wondering if there's a couple other people, Catherine or Jonathan, you've made some comments in chat.
Hmm,
I just wanted to give a couple other people an
sure.
opportunity.
Well, we had a question from Jonathan about, and it's perhaps somewhat tongue in cheek, but I think it raises an important question about perhaps engineering plants to make them behave in a way. So can we tell or engineer hostas and impatiens to grow toxins so that deer won't eat them?
Yeah, absolutely. The more we know about the plants, the more we can do. And then we get to the moral and ethical side of the question, which I'm going to sidestep. But there were some really nice videos and maybe also cartoons that came out around the talking trees and its revival 10, 20 years ago. And one that I recall is engineering plants that sit in airports and can detect terrorists. So the idea that you could engineer plants to do just about anything, maybe not walk, but just about anything else, are out there. And recently, the whole idea of artificial intelligence is coming up. And I can say just in the last week, the conversation has happened to me daily more than once for more time than I would have expected. Do plants have intelligence, and could we use computers to mimic plant intelligence? And if we could, what would we find out? So that's a whole nother topic.
And Catherine, I hope you don't mind if I make your comment that the molecular structure of chlorophyll and hemoglobin are very similar. And perhaps Liz, you could comment on the implications of that.
Yeah, absolutely. The more we know about the plants, the more we can do. And then we get to the moral and ethical side of the question, which I'm going to sidestep. But there were some really nice videos and maybe also cartoons that came out around the talking trees and its revival 10, 20 years ago. And one that I recall is engineering plants that sit in airports and can detect terrorists. So the idea that you could engineer plants to do just about anything, maybe not walk, but just about anything else, are out there. And I think of hemoglobin as an oxygen binding molecule, and there's another molecule made by plants called leg hemoglobin that has to do with nitrogen fixation. The chlorophyll has a heme ring that is responsible for absorbing the red and blue wavelengths that chlorophyll absorbs. And I don't remember the structure of hemoglobin. So maybe I'm not recalling my biochemistry well enough to know the connection, how hemoglobin and chlorophyll are similar.
Hi, it's Catherine. As I recall from being in college decades and decades ago, the chlorophyll has a magnesium in the middle,
That's right.
where the iron has, the hemoglobin has an iron in the middle.
I don't know exactly why you're recalling it or where you're going with it, but I will say that there's so many molecules in plants and animals are similar but slightly different, and helps to make plants different from animals. The difference between photosynthesis, that is the capturing of light and making sugars, and respiration, that is eating sugars and releasing heat, happens within the plant body, and it also happens just purely respiration in the animal body. So the plants are special because of chlorophyll. They can catch the light and make the sugar. And the derivation of the chlorophyll molecule and the hemoglobin molecule way back when they were single organisms might be similar, but I don't know that. Great question.
So Anne commented, thanked you for talking about how plants emit and perceive sound. It's an exciting new area of research. Now, I know that Anne is particularly interested in ambient sound within our park and just what sounds are emitted and received by animals and people and the water and the leaves and the trees and so on. I mean, you have talked about communication in very a wide-ranging set of definitions, I guess, of communication. And perhaps one thing that we didn't touch on at the very beginning in defining communication is whether it's conscious or not. And perhaps that's something that you want to skirt. I don't know, but I think it makes a big difference whether it's conscious or passive or sort of reflexive, and something that evolution has just created because it's beneficial in the context of plants.
Well, I'm glad you didn't clarify the question at the beginning, because that would have been a different talk and it would have been harder. One of the people, and maybe it was Anne who asked the question earlier about, is this all by accident or on purpose? The best way for me to look at it as a plant biologist is all of what we're talking about, the emitting of signals, the sensing of signals, responding to signals, is encoded by the DNA. However, there's some kind of argument in our field about whether the word decide or decision is apt in plants. And we all know that if you put a plant by a window, it's going to bend towards the window. Did it decide to bend to the window, or did it just bend because it was set up to bend? And I don't like to use the word decide, and I don't like to use any of the words that have to do with human cognition on plants, because I don't think plants are like humans. And so I am one person who skirts on the side of biochemistry. Well, the biochemistry is there and it happens and it's regulated. Can it be regulated in a meta fashion so that this regulation leads to that, which leads to that, which leads to that, which looks like a decision? Possibly, but we haven't studied it enough to know how that works. So the idea of plant cognition is afloat. Whether they're decisions in the way humans make decisions, I don't know.
Well, and the last comment or question that I'll make, and then perhaps we'll call this to a close. I mean, to bring it down to Sligo Creek, to the park that we are trying to protect and conserve and enjoy. We are interested in whether there are things that we should know, and perhaps they're not yet known, but things that we should know about communication between plants that would help us conserve them and treat them in a way that's beneficial, especially to the sort of the natural as best we can make it, the natural ecosystem that belongs here.
Yeah, I told you earlier on that I'm working with Friends of Seward Park and we have the same issue. And one of the problems working with the park is that it's so human impacted and meant to be. I mean, it's meant to be there in a well fashion for the humans living around it. So Sligo Creek, were it to be devoid of humans, might be a different place than Sligo Creek as a park. That has to be overlaid everything that's thought about and done. And I'm not a researcher on parks, so I don't know how to do the overlying myself. When we
No.
who are taking care of our parks in our local urban plant areas know more about how the plants work, we're likely to make better decisions. And sometimes that knowledge is going to come from regional scientists. And sometimes knowledge comes from just having done it for 20 or 50 years and seeing what works better. Don't know. Around here, people are so taken with Suzanne Simard's ideas of the Wood Wide Web and the communication by trees with fungi that I think what it leads to is having fewer paths, tamping down on the soil and scrushing up the fungi and the roots. And that's bound to be a good thing. Then you have to have a discussion of how many paths do you need for the park. And what are the fungi really doing? So if we get into a scientific argument about fungi really making a mother tree and a baby tree communicate, it's a little bit of a red herring for the health of that park. Probably the roots and the fungi of mama trees and baby trees and fungi are all sharing space and communicating molecules with each other. So the best thing in my view seems to be to interfere with it less. But somebody earlier mentioned pruning and crossing and intervention techniques that gardeners and pruners and farmers use as beneficial. They are beneficial. So then we just have to make our best wise decision, I guess.
Well, seeing no further questions in the chat and not hearing anybody shouting from the group, I want to thank you on behalf of the Friends of Sligo Creek. I've enjoyed this very much, and this has been recorded, and so we will be posting it to our website. And we have a YouTube channel, which I think is where it might show up. So you'll have other viewers, and you won't get questions from them, perhaps not directly, but I'm sure your word will be spread further throughout our watershed.
Thank you for the invitation and for listening and for sharing what Sligo Creek, Friends of Sligo Creek does. I'm so glad to know.
You're welcome, and
Thanks
good
again.
luck with your own group.
Thank you.
Good night.